We are going to get started, and we're going to end at 11:30 to allow everyone to get out before the bad weather is predicted to come in. Just rainstorms. Welcome back. Thank you again. We have a roundtable now, and as is our tradition, we want to get input from you as to what you think the single most important issue that we should deal with, whether it be a finding or a recommendation in our report. You understand we're going to deal with more than one issue, and I'm sure you have multiple issues you care about, but just to get us started, what is the single issue most in need of the Bioethics Commission's attention as we consider the ethics of neuroscience research on the one hand, and on the other, the potential applications of the results of that research on the other? So we're, to put it shorthand, and it is just a shorthand, we're thinking of the ethics of neuroscience and also the neuroscience of ethics. And I'll begin at this end with Dr. Mealy. It's like being called on, right? You didn't make eye contact, and I called on you anyway.
But I am so handicapped in answering this question because I'm not an ethicist. Yeah, I don't even ever think in a theoretical way about what's right and wrong. I just go by what my parents taught me when it comes to ethics. So can I take a pass? Is that allowed? Okay, I'm doing it.
Right.
I wanted to make a meta comment first about the question you posed to us. You said, what's the single most important question we should attend to when we're thinking about brain research and the applications made thereof? I just wanted to point out that there's a kind of an assumption underlying that question, namely that the technological applications coming out of the science. I think, in a way, equal attention should also be given to the technologies that are developed which make the science possible. And there's room for addressing, that's part of what I thought was interesting about speaking about neurotechnology-enabled brain research. In fact, wasn't it the BRAIN initiative is right, brain research through advancing innovative technologies. I mean, at least that acronym in the Obama initiative seems to recognize that there's an important bidirectional relationship between the neural technologies and the brain research, both cause.
So are you making a recommendation or just making a meta-observation?
I'm saying that when you do address ethical questions, that you also address questions that are directed at the technologies that make possible, because in the era of big science or expensive science, some science is only possible when the technologies make it possible. And if there are serious issues that are raised by those technologies, there are constraints which can be put on those because of concern with what kinds of scientific uses might be made of it. Right? So, as far as my own personal opinion about what's the most important, I guess I would nominate two things, but they're both obvious. One is consent, given all the people with vested interests in getting on with the work and tempted to be perfunctory about consent scripts and voluntariness. It's got to be rigorous and maybe done by third parties. Just, And then the other one is the notion of harm again. It should not be simply physiological harm. It should be also think seriously about the potential for effects on psychic well-being.
Thank you. Dr. Lin.
On saying what would be most important, what I'm about to say is personal. It's not a view of the academies. It should be, but it's not. It actually came up in a conversation with Christine in the sidebar. Mostly the study of the consideration of ethics and ethical issues in science is seen by scientists as a block. as a bad thing. Somebody's going to stop me from doing what I want to do. And we in fact tried, as we tried to grapple with the history of LC in science, we couldn't find really important examples of where important research was motivated by ethical concerns. I mean, there are probably some. You could argue, for example, that the atomic bomb was driven by, the research on the atomic bomb was in fact driven by positive ethical concerns. We didn't want Hitler to win the war and to get it first. But mostly when people think about ethics in science, and certainly the practicing scientists, this was the reason why we emphasize lightweight processes, that mostly scientists see consideration of ethical issues in some formal sense as an impediment to their work. And if you can find a way of turning it around to where ethics can support their work, that's really an important thing to do. I mean, the point is that in the language of economics, the incentives right now are misaligned to think about ethics in any serious way. If you can change the market, quote, the market, and, I think you're in a much better shape.
Thank you. Dr. Green?
So I'm not qualified, I think, to put my finger on a particular policy question, but speaking as an experimental psychologist and a neuroscientist, I think the take-home message that I would give is one that I spent a lot of time on in my original remarks, although that's not where our discussion went on, which just comes back to the camera analogy and the idea that we have automatic settings in manual mode, we have gut reactions, and we have the ability to reflect. And I think that we are too ready to trust our automatic settings, too ready to trust our gut reactions about things. And I think as the camera analogy suggests, for most of the time our gut reactions are pretty good. It's not like get rid of them. But when it comes to bioethical issues, which really force us to confront things that our brains were not designed by biology or culture or personal experience to handle well, or at least we can't count on them being so, we really have to be willing to put our gut reactions aside and think about things in a more reflective way. And I would urge to think specifically about the consequences of different policy choices.
Thank you for coming back to that, because that is a very positive point. It feeds into and we've taken great pains to not simply focus on the thou shalt nots of ethics, but what actually the potential is of science. And is it the case that what you're saying, you also said at the beginning, is of a piece with, it should not be just neuroscience, but behavioral science more generally. So Danny Kahneman's thinking fast and thinking
Exactly.
slow
That's right.
is of a piece where there's evidence also of how our fast thinking works in many situations, but not in
Right.
many other important ones.
And to add to that, I would say that it's really the behavioral research that's primary, and I view the neuroscientific research as just a piece of that.
But it's
Yeah.
I can say without, by tooting your horn and other neuroscientists, that it's an important piece, and it may become an increasingly important piece, but it is a piece of behavioral research. So, I want to, yes,
may make a
please,
brief comment.
and then I'm going to recognize Nita, who was next on the queue earlier. Oh, you got your question, and you don't want to, okay, I have Christine then. Please.
Just a brief comment
No,
in response to Professor Lynn's comment about science perceived as a barrier or something that blocks. And I think there are several sources to that, and one is, and I've got concrete experience of that when I gave a presentation on ethical issues related to nanotechnology to the heads of 13 nanotechnology laboratories at an NSF meeting. And there was initial incredible resistance there because they perceive ethics to be A, either religiously based, believe it or not, or B, that it's equivalent to moralism. And that there's no sense, they view it as, they put it into the camp of the subjective. It's not data driven, this kind of a thing. So there are really some stereotypes that scientists have about, and then the third confusion is that the belief that in doing ethics that you're somehow trying deliberately to change people's behavior as opposed to letting them know about what some of the issues are so that they can't plead ignorance of those things downstream. So there's a lot of stereotypes about ethics that scientists and engineers have that can be combated, but they are rarely combated.
Steve?
Thank you. Maybe I'll go back to Dr. McGinn's comment that clearly alerted a number of us. Could we use imaging to rank and grade our brains? Yet I do this every day, tracking disease, and we always judge each other in many ways, and we rank each other formally through other means, and we rank our cognitive performance formally and make judgments about that. So my question is, how are emerging imaging technologies more than incrementally changing this landscape?
Well, first of all, if you're asking for a technical answer, you're asking the wrong person. But, I mean, I have several responses to your question. And one is, old ethical wine in new technological bottles can still be very important. So it may not be a fundamentally different ethical question than the question of how people should react to information about our genetic natures. But until we passed the House bill, and that employers could not really utilize genetic information in making employment decisions, it was open to people to utilize that now accessible information about genes in making such discriminations between people. So again, by the way, I have found, it's really interesting, that many people, the majority of the people that I surveyed, were of the opinion that unless an issue was unique to a particular technology, it was not worth paying attention to. So they would tell me what's different about this, as if to say, if there's nothing different, then it's not really worth paying attention. That's where the metaphor came from. Old ethical wine in new technological bottles could still be worth savoring, or whatever you do to wine. So yeah, that's sort of my response to your thing.
Maybe I could just follow up a little bit, because you've written about the obligation to limit distortion as we communicate the value of
and not to cooperate with it, being written by someone else. Yeah, I think that, for example, one of the questions on my most recent survey had to do with whether or not researchers have an ethical responsibility if they know that somebody with whom, a journalist or media person with whom they've cooperated, is about to engage in, what you might say, hype or exaggeration or distortion of their most recent finding, even if it's to their benefit. Do they have an ethical responsibility to do the best they can? Obviously, they don't have the ability to control it, to try and do something to rectify that. Or is it ethically permissible for them to acquiesce in that distortion? I think there is an ethical responsibility to do that. And one of the reasons is that if people acquiesce cumulatively in distortion, and the people who are getting the money and whose results are being trumpeted don't deliver the goods, it can really then challenge the credibility of the enterprise. That's the other reason, by the way, about your point about incentives being not aligned. I think ethics can be a really important and good thing for the scientific enterprise. If no other reason, this is the reason why I think NSF has insisted on it. They don't want it to be able to be said about them downstream if something were to go wrong, that they did not attend upstream to the ethical and social issues. So it's a form of rational insurance policy.
It actually flows from Josh's beware of gut reactions, and rather than things that if you're thinking more slowly you would do. So immediate incentives may be to avoid ethical issues and just get on with narrow science. But one major ethical lapse in especially, but not only in an emerging science, and it can derail the progress of that for a long times. So being proactive, as we've called for, and integrative in ethics makes practical, not just ethical sense, if you're committed, as we are as a society, to moving scientific progress forward. That doesn't speak to the ranking of brains. I think Steve's point on that is we do hire people in part on basis of their cognitive capacities, and that has an implicit ranking in it, and the more we know about people's cognitive capacities, we shouldn't do it falsely based on irrelevant or false data, but I think you're worried about a kind of rise of the meritocracy. Michael, is my reference resonant? Do you know Michael Young's Rise of the Meritocracy, where
I
everybody,
haven't read it.
the society is ranked solely on the basis of some meritocratic ranking?
But, you know, insofar as you are suggesting, and I'm not sure whether you are, that this is deja vu all over again.
No, I'm not suggesting
Okay,
that.
but I think the fundamental difference here is that these technologies and the brain research that they make possible might allow us to have information about brains which is more than simply guesses or based on hunches or observation. And that can be seized upon by individuals to make discriminations, you know, when it comes to allocating resources, for example. And that's a different deal than relying upon hunches or giving tests or, you know, how clever a conversationalist somebody is.
Yeah.
I think, you know, and I'm also concerned about the social constructions that might be made of that intelligence that we are able to allegedly measure with respect to these new,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
I can see that being a can of worms.
Yeah. Christine? Oh, okay. Let me just follow up on that then for the record. So there's a lot of science has potential good as well as potential bad. Finding out more about the human brain certainly falls into that category. There's some science, the development of the atomic bomb was one in which many of the scientists engaged in that project said, it's only because we have an enemy of the sort of that Hitler represents that we would be that we're willing to do that. They said that. But that was because they were developing a weapon of mass destruction that they could not imagine that they doing if there weren't an enemy of the sort of Hitler out there. Everything that we're talking about, I think, in neuroscience has potentially some very good applications as well as potentially some bad ones, and I'm wondering whether we're correct in our primary concern that we enable the progress of this science with minimal constraints on the progress. Minimal being set by what would be ethically wrong to do. Go ahead.
I've responded. One brief comment about your atomic bomb example, right? After we knew that we basically had defeated Germany, so that wasn't no longer the original animating motive for the development of the atomic bomb. Okay. Only one scientist resigned from the Manhattan Project, Joseph Rotblat. It's well to keep in mind, as well as Oppenheimer's famous phrase, a sweet intellectual problem. The notion of momentum that can attach to a scientific endeavor, a scientific cum technological endeavor, is not to be forgotten, it seems to me. And then I just had one brief response to your comments.
Right, but you're not suggesting anything that's now being done in neuroscience. I mean, if you are, I'm not asking this as a rhetorical question.
No.
Tell us, because
No.
I don't know
No.
of anything that's
No.
being done in
No.
neurosciences of the
No,
sort of...
I do not.
Okay.
But I do, one little observation I did have, which was suggested by your comment, instead of thinking about neuroscience en bloc, as you made that comment, the thought emerged in my mind that might it be useful to sort of break that up? I mean, if you think about the neurotechnologies that make possible various kinds of brain research. So rather than talking about brain research, it can have good or bad, therefore, think about different subdomains of neurotechnologies that might make this kind of an inquiry, for example, to alleviate an aneurysm or something, combating epilepsy, versus other ones which might be more diagnostic and lend themselves. So I think that breaking it up in terms of technologies can help one to avoid the usual treating it as a blob.
Yeah, we're not treating it as a block, we're just speaking in, but there could be funded research on that, so that would be important. Dan?
Yeah, I was,
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
You wanted to, you perhaps sought an example. There is some neuroscience research now that seeks to understand the neuroscience of trust, right, of interpersonal trust. And one can it's certainly an interesting problem, and you can certainly imagine ways of manipulating perceptions of trust as a result of this. Can I think of good ways of doing this? Sure. Can I think of really bad ways of doing that? Also, so I mean, I'm sure there are many other examples of that kind of thing. I think the sort of thing that Bob is referring to is that to the extent possible, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I think what you're saying is that to the extent possible, think about what the downside is and try to establish blocks against it. Not to suppress the research in any way, but to at least anticipate that this is a possibility.
Yeah, we got it,
Right.
and I think appreciate that. One of our colleagues who's a senior advisor to the commission, Jonathan Moreno, has written a lot on the topic of potentially threatening uses as well as the good uses. Dan?
we've in some previous work talked about having a sort of fact check, for claims made, for instance, in synthetic biology, et cetera. I'm wondering whether we ought to have, in some ways, whether there would be room for a sort of exaggerated neuroscience implications check .com or something, and wonder if beyond, we spend a lot of time talking about free will versus mechanism, free will versus determinism, whether there aren't other things that we might want to think about, and if you have other suggestions, I'd like to hear them. For instance, mechanism versus supervenient mind, Aristotle versus Kant and Mill, hardwired for altruism, hardwired for determinism. I mean, these are, are those kinds of claims that need to be, in all of your views, debunked, or are they, reasonable claims that ought to be out there and respected? So.
Say one thing to that, which is just SFN has started a blog that does a fact check on a number of things, including, they haven't gotten into a free will one, but they've done neuroscience in the courtroom, they've done quite a few different overclaim things, which has been terrific, and then they reach out to other experts and have them, do additional fact checking on it, and they update it, and it's really a great resource and one that I think is a really welcome addition.
I don't think I can answer that question directly, but I've done a lot of interviews because of the big grants and other things with journalists. And what happens is they'll keep asking until you say the kind of thing they want to hear. And a lot of people don't know that, so it might be nice if we had like information for, let's say, scientists about how to conduct an interview, just tips and advice. I actually helped an alcohol marketer do a responsible drinking campaign, and I did TV and stuff, and so I had to go through this little bit of training, and actually it helped me later on when I was interviewing people about the grants. So if you don't say certain things, then they won't report it, and the general news will be more accurate than it can be.
This actually does also go back to the main point that Josh underlined for us, which I hope we can incorporate in our report because it actually is directly relevant to journalism. If two people are too ready to trust their gut reactions, this poses a very big challenge to education because we have to try to educate people to think about more than just what their gut reaction is. And journalists are very aware that they need readers, and if they can get to people's gut reaction with exactly the example that Josh began with, one human interest story will beat out whatever number you put out there, 1,000 victims of a hurricane, 10,000 victims of a terrorist attack. One story that just gets people's emotional juices going beats that out. The only antidote to that is not any restrictions on the free press, is not, I think, a lot of education of journalists, because the only antidote to that is the education of the public. And while this isn't, and our society, while this isn't bioethics, it's a subset of ethics. If our society invests very little in educating the public, the downstream effects of that on the appreciation of science, on the appreciation of thinking slow versus thinking fast, are going to be bad, not good. So while that's a very general statement, I think it's an accurate one, and it flows from something that we are learning from research, that people are more wired to think, fast rather than slow, and that's a serious problem. We had Herbert, you want to say
yes,
something?
I
And
wanted to.
I have to ask Bob to if you would shut up your mic. Thank you.
I have a lot of sympathy with what you said a minute ago about educating public to pay less attention to their gut and more attention to their analytical processes and so on. I note with a certain regret that the advice that we get from people who study the process of science communications to the public goes exactly in the opposite direction, which is that the right antidote is not to try to persuade the public to think more slowly, but rather to get them to think fast in ways that are more favorable.
So you have to get people's attention first. So this is again, so self-correcting what I just said, it's not that you can just assume everyone has got an analytic intelligence. We don't ourselves. Even those of us who pride ourselves on it, we don't. So you have to get people's attention first, and telling stories and using examples, as this commission knows I harp on, we have to use examples. But then you have to move on to the data, the evidence, and so on, right? So yeah,
no disagreement,
I think this
but
it's been very helpful to have this, because it's an important part of what we need to do. Jim has a question from a member of the audience.
Actually, we have several submissions from the audience, but and it gives me an opportunity, first of all, to thank the audience and a number of very thoughtful people and professionals that we have here, faculty and physicians and students. Some of these are in the nature of, I would really like to communicate to you on my own research in free will, or et cetera. I don't know as we announced today, but we want that input. We don't use these sessions for that, but we want that input, and we ask for it to be submitted on info@bioethics.gov for our staff to look at. But the question is from PhD student Stephanie Hain, or Hare, is asking right in the subject, the concept, of course, that public scholarship and public attention seems to prey on the impulsive, whereas academic health sciences research is supposed to be more reflective. She's wondering about not just educating the public, but she writes, can we or should we focus on strategies to change the structure of the academy through policy and curricular change? Many, especially young researchers, feel pressure to overinterpret their results or overstate claims related to neuroscience and psychology research, especially in the realm of moral decision-making. Comments that this may even help you get published in the larger named journals, right? One wonders what's happening with Nature and Science at times. So she is saying, is there something not just about educating the public, but what about educating our students in this area? To be, well, you already mentioned, give them a little media prep, but also with regard to understanding how we communicate most productively within the academy and more carefully outside.
Just a brief sort of statement of fact that at Stanford there are 2 courses in the entire School of Engineering that have the word ethics in them.
2 courses?
In the School of Humanities and Sciences there are none, and there is 1 in the School of Medicine. So I've always found it really interesting that, and I don't mean this to be nasty, but the natural science community seems to be very reluctant to introduce ethics courses as things which would somehow be required and an integral part of education at the undergraduate or graduate level for their students. I mean, at least at the undergraduate level, for example, at Stanford, every undergraduate engineering student must take a course dealing with issues of responsibility having to do with engineering. It's a requirement. Okay. I don't know why that is, but you know, Letterman's statement, I think the scientific community just wants to think that it's somehow it's a different beast, and you really shouldn't traffic in those kinds of things, other than you know, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism.
Okay.
FFP.
Dr. Maley, I'm going to give you the last word before I wrap up.
Okay, yeah, I have just a brief thought on that, but we have lots of studies, for example, showing that priming people with the belief that there's no free will increases misbehavior. And there are data like that in other domains too, like if you tell people they don't have self-control, will it get worse? So if people who are going to be talking to the press or doing these studies or thinking about exaggerating are exposed to hard data indicating that this news has a bad effect, then that might just make them think a little harder about being more accurate and not exaggerating. I think that could help. It's not coercive even, it's just informing.
Thank you. And I want to just say on behalf of the whole commission and our terrific staff that this has been very edifying, interesting, and it will help us in thinking through our report. And I want to thank the 4 of you for joining us and taking the time and the thoughtfulness to give us good advice. So thank you very much, and we are adjourned.